All right, good morning, everybody. So this is our last class. Isn't that scary? Crazy? So part of what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about the final and some other pieces that are going on. So if you look at the announcements for this class, I actually posted the biggest point question for this, for the final, is actually posted ahead of time, so you can work ahead of time on that. That said, I will not offer solicitations or help except for general, can I use something like this? Yes, those kinds of questions. So, you're going to have to make a egg timer. And so we've done something similar to this, but this egg timer is going to count down from 3 minutes, has to show minutes and seconds, and you have to use nested loops. You can't just put 180 seconds in a loop. You have to use a pair of nested loops. So you're going to submit that then inside of Blackboard on your final when you are done, so you can certainly work on that portion ahead of time. So that's part one of your final, so you get some of that done. So if I look at the calendar, so the 1st of May is the last day I will take any assignments for this class. So that way, if you're behind, you're trying to get stuff caught up, I am going to close out the books on May 1st. So everything's going to get locked in place, and then I can go ahead and finish whatever grading is left for that. So important date to note, just in case, May 1st. Your final is due by May 5th at midnight. There will be or cannot be any extensions on that date. So the earlier you get it done, the better. It's actually, I've just made it up and available right now. You'll see that it's live in there. You are allowed up to 2 hours to take the final, which consists of, I believe, 38 questions. So we'll talk about those in just a second. So this week there is a discussion board that's due, so you'll need to work on this and make sure that is completed. And then we have an assignment that we'll work on here in just a second. So let's talk about the final first and what kind of things you'll need to know to be successful on this final. So we've talked a little bit about classes and objects. You'll need to know a little bit about those. You don't need to know every complete detail. We just kind of introduced it and started talking about the idea of object-oriented programming. But you will need to know what a class and an object is. So a class defines that. An object is once it's actually created, you've created an object. So a couple of other things to look at. You need to make sure you remember all the way back when we talked about there were 3 different types of code structures. That you could use sequences, you could use selections or loops, and everything is built around those ideas. So sequences, selections, and loops. You'll need to remember back to what different types of data types there are. And in Python, we really have only a couple. We have strings, so in other words, something that we manipulate as a chunk, a string, and we have numbers. And in Python, we have 2 different types of numbers. So we have integers and floats. Floats have decimal points, integers don't. A lot of other languages, there's significantly more. There's short integers, long integers, and different pieces. Luckily for us, Python really only has those 2 data types. You'll need to know what the word Boolean means. So what is a Boolean expression? So if I'm asking a question that has 2 possibilities, that's a Boolean question. Looking down my list here, constants. Although we aren't able to enforce them in Python, most languages do. A constant in Python, we do all capitals, and we say that we're only going to have that in there once. It's something that's used over and over again, but we don't want it changed. So a constant's in our list of things you want to look at. What about loop types? So we basically consider two different types of loops. We consider a definitive loop one that runs a set number of times. So a for loop that says it's going to run 5 times is a definitive loop. A loop that runs as many times as we want, like a while loop, so while some condition is true, is our other type of loop. Let me look here. We've used this idea before, but you probably should know what a dummy value is. So when we've written a piece of code and we say, keep going until you type in 999, that 999 is our dummy value that we put in, or a blank enter. So somehow we can say, yes, we're done with this code section, let's move on. So we talked about a for loop. We have what are called while do loops. So while something is true, we do an action. So while the temperature is still below 65, the furnace will continue to run. So those kinds of loops. Our loops typically use some kind of a sentinel value to exit out of that loop. So maybe it's, the temperature is above a value. So make sure you're familiar with that. There is a question or two about arrays, or in Python we call them lists or tuples. So an array is just that set of buckets that we call by one variable name, and then we have multiple pieces in it. If we have an array, we access it using something called the index or the subscript. In other words, at position 1, I want this piece of data. That's the index or subscript. So you need to make sure you know how those function. On the test, there are several pieces of code written out saying, what is this going to do? You are certainly welcome to put them into Python and try to run them to figure out what the output will be. However, Python is very picky about indents, and you've probably seen that from my random typing. So those indents are important. So when you copy and paste it at a Blackboard in the test module, you will likely have to fix the indents so that it's indented correctly and all the way to the left and indented. I've seen that before, and it depends in some cases what browser you're trying to copy and paste out of. So make sure you realize that when you're trying to use them into IDA. But that's the best way to find the correct answer, because you'll literally run the code and actually see what it's going to say. So you will probably have to make sure you put those in with the correct indents. So with that, Python works in this idea of blocks. And our code is in blocks. So anytime we indent an entire block, we know that that belongs maybe to an if statement or something else. So make sure you understand what that is. So we talked about the egg timer. It has to use nested loops. The other item that will appear on here is there are probably a couple of questions about Monty Python. Who's Monty Python? Well, it's a group of actors that have several movies. So I just make some jokes in there about it. So Life of Brian, there's whole tons of Monty Python stuff. It's really good humor. Most of it has stood up to the test of time, but there's some questions about some of the individuals there. So don't be surprised if you see a question like that about it. And there have been some actors that came out of that comedy troupe, and like John Cleese, for example, who went on to become a respected actor and is well renowned. So information that you might want to know. All right, any questions about the final before we move on?
In your announcements, you have on the bottom of the
The import time, yeah, because what I'm saying there is you can use the time.sleep as a way to pause it for a second. You actually want to say yes. Yeah. You can import all kinds of things, but it has to be in. So you have to have an inner loop for the seconds and an outer loop for the minutes. That's the one caveat on there. All right, good question. Any other questions on the final? So my sense that most students actually did this in about 45 minutes is probably about where you should be time-wise. I would certainly plan ahead a little longer if you know. But since you can do this out of 15, is 15% of the final grade, so make sure you do that one ahead of time. Most of the questions are worth a couple of points and run through there. So, all right. If no questions about the final, if you do have some, send it to me, and if it's relevant to the entire class, I will send that on as a announcement or something else to see where you're at. So I will make an announcement about Sunday, so that make sure everybody gets the whatever materials they're behind on. Remember that you can pull one assignment for week 4. Is it the 14-week discussion board? So I've got to go through and figure out which ones we're using for those. But, it's 100 points, I believe, in here. So it's a pretty good chunk of points, but it should raise most people's grades. If you do this piece outside and get it to run and work well, and you do, fairly well on the final, you'll be amazed what you're doing. All right. All right, so we're back working with our Bouncy program, so Bouncy with GUI. So what we'd like to do is see if we can make this function over here run. So let's see what happens. And refresh where we're at. Bounciness index, typically under 1 because it's going to bounce. 1 would be it bounces exactly as high as it started with. But we know that we lose a little bit. And then the maximum number of bounces. All right. So that's where we need to figure out what our area is. Bouncy GUI object has no attribute bounces field. Okay. Let me make this a little bigger so we can see it. Alright, so it is looking at line 63 to start with. Bounces field dot get number. And so we need the is that many bounces. Get rid of some of those to make life a little easier. Alright, so we need to find out where it's pulling this issue. So 60 self.bounces.field. Why do I not have that? Self.bounces field. Add integer field. Alright, so apparently up here I tried to call that computer. So let's run checks and let's see what happens on this. Disengage. perfect. All right, so it actually does go through, and it apparently checked it correctly. So let's go over from the top and kind of see what is in here. Make sure we're all on the same page. All right, so we're importing pieces from this easy frame. So we took from this file, which if you go over and look, you can actually see a file here. So we're taking pieces of that and importing it. We've defined our compute distance, or as I tried to reference it, computer distance. So this is the same formulas we used back when we did this just in a non-GUI method. And then we have this class bouncy GUI, and this is where we set up the fields that are inside of this box. So we added the height, the bounciness, the number of bounces, the compute, and total distance. So, and the way we did that, we used the add label in the height field. So we would set these boxes. The compute distance, then we actually referenced and got the number then out of those boxes, each one. And then here we did the set number to push it back out to the distance box. So once we put all these pieces together, and I'm not trying to type and talk, that's what we end up with. It's kind of a handy little graphical interface. Yep, I can. How far up? Yeah. So this section here is the same as what we used before to solve this problem, but in a non-graphical manner. So, all right. Okay. I'm assuming this is where you're wanting to look at. So the only one that's really tricky in here, or different, is really this when we add the button. And the button then we add not only where it's at, row and column. We're going to say it's going to span 2 column spaces. And then we say, all right, when somebody pushes it, then it's going to call the function compute distance. And then it actually leads down into there.
That's where I'm stuck. I can't figure it out either, because it's saying that I have in my one in compute distance bounce equals silk dot bounce field dot get number, but it doesn't. I can't make sense of it.
My guess is some kind of silly typing error, or because that's typically what. So it's on the command when you're having an issue, or one of the other ones.
Yeah, when I run it on the desktop.
Okay.
When I enter all my steps, when I hit compute, it doesn't compute it, and then the terminal gives me on mine is 152, the compute distance bounce equals self dot bounces with dot get number, and it says it's a tricky error.
Okay. So if you're getting something like that, my guess is it's actually, so it's working to here essentially, and then, or it's built that whole GUI, and when you hit that command button, it should run this. So my guess is your error is actually somewhere in here.
In the bottom part.
Yeah, in the
handler part.
Yep.
Okay.
Because you've got the button to work, and it files for this, and then says, oh, well, something is not right. So this is where we get those values: height, index, bounces, distance. And then this is where we actually compute that distance. So the other place you could have an error is up on this section here, where it actually does the calculations. So I would look at both of those really carefully and see if you can solve those. So sometimes that troubleshooting is kind of the trickier piece of these. Just figuring out where you have an error at. Now, this has really no error checking. You could break it. And now it's going to hiccup, and you see it in the control panel over here. We couldn't convert a string to float because we don't have that capability. So we don't have any error handling built into this. But most people aren't going to type A when they say what's the height in there.